the Space Valley is sort of this new, I think, very neat but unexpected kind of ancillary benefit that occurred to all this work that we at AFRL pioneered by working in the private sector.
Welcome to the Transfer Files, inside the world of federal innovation. This is your insider's look at how federal laboratories bring groundbreaking technologies to market. I'm your host, Andrea Nelson. In every episode, we'll bring you insights and expertise from throughout the world of tech transfer. Today's guest is Gabe Mounce, Director of Tech Engagement at the Air Force Research Laboratory in New Mexico. Gabe has spent years helping launch public-private partnerships that bridge federal science with commercial space innovation. And in that process, he's helped lay the groundwork for what's now being called the Space Valley, a growing corridor of space tech development stretching from Colorado Springs to El Paso. In this episode, Gabe walks us through how AFRL's work with incubators, accelerators, and academic partners is not only transferring technology, but building regional economies. He shares fascinating success stories, like a solar array that now powers commercial satellites, and a cancer-predicting algorithm that pivoted to forecast satellite health. We also dig into the challenge of matchmaking between labs and companies and what it will take to scale up those regional collaborations. Let's jump in. Gabe Mounce, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you, Andrea, for inviting me onto the podcast. Happy to be with you.
Absolutely. So let's start by getting into some of your professional background and tell us about how you got into tech transfer.
Yeah, it's an interesting story. So I guess, I've been a career Department of the Air Force person, I guess you could say. I started out active duty with the Air Force. And then about, 14 years ago, it's been a while now, it feels like 14, 15 years ago, I transferred off active duty into civilian capacity, and I got picked up at the Air Force Research Lab here in New Mexico. We have two of the technical centers here in New Mexico. One is focused on space, what we call space vehicles, but it's really space research related to, satellites and the systems that we deploy into space. The other tech center is what we call directed energy. So it has to do with lasers, high power microwaves, large optics, and those kinds of things. And I was kind of doing, bench level, if you will, research or just technology development on the space side of the house. And then in about 2016, 17 time period, the chief scientist on the space side of the house asked me to come join the tech transfer team. At the time, I wasn't really sure why. I didn't quite understand what tech transfer actually did. But it turns out the office was being kind of revamped, and they wanted some more people from the space side in that office to kind of help really do the engagement. Here we call our office the Tech Engagement Office for the Air Force Research Lab here in New Mexico. And that office actually is pretty broad. It encompasses tech transfer and transition, but it does a lot of other things, including kind of the community engagement, the ecosystem engagement for the tech sector, especially here in New Mexico. And so I think the chief scientist at the time saw that I had an interest in kind of that tech sector engagement piece, and asked me to come join the team to ultimately help, lead what we call tech transfer and transition.
And when we're talking about tech transfer and transition, but coming from a space context, talk about how that transitions over. Does it need to be transformed to something we use on Earth, or is it going into commercial space sort of applications?
Yeah. So, a lot of the work that we pioneer here at AFRL, especially for the space side of the house, which is what I'm probably the most familiar with, we're doing development for, we're pushing forward the basic science into applied science, and then into the application of that science in real systems that have to do with how do you increase spacecraft survivability, their resilience in space. For a long time, we were also pioneering how do you enable kind of a decrease of the form factor for articles you put in space, mainly because, right, it's so expensive to put objects into orbit. The whole idea is, could you do the same kind of mission sets with smaller spacecraft that weren't quite as expensive? And what we call it, we were trying to reduce the size, weight, and power, and we long have been kind of pioneering the tech development along reducing size, weight, and power for satellites and objects that we put into orbit. So we were doing that. We were pioneering things like advanced precision navigation and timing, which are really, that's kind of another way to say GPS, the GPS system. How do we do next gen GPS, including more advanced timing mechanisms, atomic clocks and those kinds of things? So that was a lot of the research on the space side that went into pushing the envelope for what you could do with the technology. But eventually, at some point, in order to get that into real fielded systems that the Air Force, and of course now the Space Force uses, right? Side note, right? The Space Force set up about 5 years ago. So those of us in the space side of the house became Space Force guardians. We were kind of carved out, transitioned from the Air Force side into Space Force now. And so all this work went into, pushing the envelope forward and what satellites could do. But to do that, right, you had to commercialize that technology, which, really is where my office comes in, is to transition. We transfer that technology out of the lab. So in some cases, commercialize it by licensing the IP around some of these technologies, advanced solar cell technology, for instance, or we transfer the technical expertise that we have pioneered to the commercial sector through our tech transfer office, through all the mechanisms like CRADAS and cooperative agreements and the whole nine yards. Break, there's another element here, right? Mm-hmm. The commercial space sector itself is growing quite significantly and has now for the last several years because launch costs, I said earlier, launch is expensive. It's expensive to get things into orbit, but those launch costs now are starting to significantly decrease, largely due to a lot of the big companies that are making that happen, like SpaceX, Blue Origin, and others, Firefly Space, Rocket Lab. There's plenty of other commercial launch companies that are making it cheaper to get to orbit. So because of that, in the wild, out in kind of the normal entrepreneurial space, we are seeing a lot more founders and entrepreneurs create endeavors, a lot of venture-backed startups that are on their own trying to field systems into space, which is awesome, right? It's really awesome from the perspective of an industrial base development that we really depend on for this commercialization aspect for the space force. But that is starting, because that has been growing for the last 5 years, it's intersected with our need to commercialize. And so we are now using a lot more of the Department of the Air Force language. We call it tech transfer and transition, that third T. Mm-hmm. We call it T3, right? And that third T is transition. And that transition for us means, how do we now look across that commercial landscape and figure out what can be utilized for mission purposes? Is there technology that can meet mission purposes, capabilities, and other things that we can now use by the Space Force that we once didn't have access to because there just wasn't that broad base of industrial base kind of putting that together. And so my job at the tech transfer office is to kind of put together that chain of events, all the way from the applied science and the technology development aspect in the lab. How do we get that into the commercial space? Because we only buy systems. The Space Force only buys actual systems. They don't necessarily buy the underlying technology directly. How do we get the technology then into the system provider's hands? And then how do we then buy back that technology as a system in the Space Force? So that whole chain of event is something that my office helps with. Transfer it out into the commercial sector, and then when it's ready, transition it back into the Space Force and to the mission side.
Wow. And because a big piece of what you were just explaining has to do with how, the evolution, changing launch costs, a changing sort of commercial space sector. So how has that landscape changed in the time that you've been doing this?
Yeah, so when I started in about 2016, 17, like I said, right about that time frame, we were just starting to see the companies like the private sector companies like SpaceX really start to showcase their new commercial case for private launch and reusable launch. That's the other key factor is a lot of these companies now that are getting into the commercial launch game. Part of the reason they're bringing costs down is because they're reusing the launch vehicle. And so that's been going on. Those companies, especially SpaceX, they're the pioneers. I remember way back in 2013 reading an article in Wired magazine that was more or less outlining what SpaceX was attempting to do. So they've been working on it for a while. But about the time I came into this tech transfer role is really when they started actually doing that launch, showcasing that launch case, if you will, bringing down, showcasing how you could bring down the cost. And as that gained momentum in the commercial market, I started seeing drastically this kind of acceleration, if you will, or quick rise of this newer entrepreneurial landscape of space companies, little small space companies that were essentially trying to model themselves out after Silicon Valley entrepreneurs, simply because they knew they could do things cheaper potentially with these lower launch costs. But this lower launch cost allowed them to innovate in a ways that we just have never seen before from the federal government side, right? The federal government has always been the biggest underwriter of the space market, right? Because we're the ones that pioneered it. U.S. government, NASA, and the U.S. Air Force at the time. We've long been the largest underwriter of that, but over time, we're seeing, especially during that period, that this newer market segment was kind of bringing down those costs. We're still kind of the largest customer in that market, but because there's so much more innovation happening in that commercial sector, you can think of it from the perspective that entrepreneurs love to try new endeavors to kind of create value. In this case, they were looking at this new space sector as a potential way to drive value, or I should say derive value in and from space, just like you do for other endeavors they're looking at in Silicon Valley. And so as that kind of momentum increased, it created this whole new innovation landscape that we just hadn't seen before, but that we also really wanted to tap into. And that started to occur. It seemed to me that started to occur really around the time frame I came into this office. And over the period of time I've been here, just really, that whole market segment has just really taken off. No pun intended, right? Taken off into orbit to advance this new kind of growing, really, fantastic market segment.
Excellent. It seems like it's accelerated just at a pace that I would not have believed 10 or 15 years ago. And just before we get sort of deeper in, could you clarify sort of with the U.S. Space Force and NASA and the work that both do, what's the distinction and or the overlap there?
Yeah, it's a great question. There's always, just for context setting, right? The U.S. Air Force has long been the military service, the U.S. military service that has really overseen and operated the DoD's kind of space mission for the services. You also have the intelligence community as well. They have a whole element of space segment that they work with. Several of the agencies in the intelligence community do that as well. And there's a lot of close ties between the DoD side to what was the Air Force and the intelligence community. On the NASA side, the NASA has always been the commercial space, if you will, or let me rephrase that, not commercial. We see commercial so much now, it's always in my vernacular. The civil side, the U.S. government civil side in space utilization, space exploration, space science, the whole 9 yards from the civil perspective. They were kind of the main agency that most people know doing that. And of course now with the Space Force standing up to take over that space mission from the Air Force, there is a lot of close collaboration with NASA on the underlying technology development across, the areas of interest. And there is a lot of overlap in the interest for what we do in space. But the two distinct goals, if you will, of the two different agencies between NASA and the Space Force is that NASA really focused on that space exploration, pioneering, pushing the boundaries of what we understand about space, and especially they're most known for the kind of the manned space flight and how we explore space through kind of manned missions. Whereas the Space Force is really focused on how do you enable the DoD to do its defense mission, its national security mission, utilizing space. So one example, right? I think the most common example and the easiest for us to explain is the GPS system. The GPS system has always been owned and operated by the U.S. Air Force. And of course, now it's the U.S. Space Force that does that. Even though it is definitely a foundational underpinning for all of what we consider civil society right now, its main purpose was to enable, precision, navigation, and timing for our fielded forces in their theaters as they were pursuing their missions. It's been a foundational element to really enable us to really be and prosecute modern warfare, and why we as the U.S. have been so good at it. We also specifically enable communications, downrange communications that just were never possible, before the advent of spacecraft in orbit that could enable kind of that communications relay between commanders and their forces in the field. And then you also have, just like the intelligence agencies, a lot of remote sensing. How do we look at the Earth? A lot of cameras, essentially, a lot of ways to look at the Earth and sense what's happening so that we know what the particular mission, what the particular theater is looking like when it comes to a conflict, so that we can better, maneuver our forces to advance in that conflict. That's all military national security stuff that the Space Force does for, specific national security purposes. Not really the mission set of NASA as a civil agency. So all that to say, that long story long, just to say that even though there's these two distinct particular objectives between the two agencies, there is still a lot of shared interest in the underlying technology that goes into the capabilities of these satellite systems that both agencies deploy, which means also there is a lot of commonality and cross collaboration between NASA and offices like mine that are interested in the tech transfer element of science and technology for the research lab.
Excellent. Thank you. That actually does help really clarify it, the way that you explained it. And so coming back to focus on what your office does, what kinds of assets and elements in Albuquerque and New Mexico are you able to tap into when it comes to sort of the regional ecosystem?
Yeah, thank you. We, as I said before, we have been doing a lot of, we have long done what I would call traditional tech transfer, and traditional makes it sound a little bit maybe archaic, and that's not meant to say that. We, like any federal lab, right, we have that really strong mission to take the inventions, take the expertise that we pioneer in this federal lab sector and get them into that commercial sector. And so we have been doing that for a while. We in the Air Force usually utilize the partnership intermediary agreement to help us do that. That's one of those PAs are kind of underneath one of the tech transfer authorities or at least adjacent to the Tech Transfer Authority to let us do that mission. So we have long had a partnership intermediary agreement with one of our local universities, New Mexico Tech, and they have long helped us, facilitated and assisted us with that more traditional tech transfer mission. So they have been doing outstanding work in our ecosystem and really helping us get the word out about our technology, assisting the commercial private sector side with understanding how they can utilize the lab and the expertise that we can bring, enabling us to find ways to partner with the private sector, for instance, in utilizing our test facilities, or I shouldn't say test facilities, just our normal R&D facilities that could be used for purposes like testing out of the research lab. New Mexico Tech has long helped us with that mission. All the time I've been here, we've also then explored and pioneered ways to use these kinds of tech transfer mechanisms like TIAs, and even just normal non-FAR agreements like cooperative agreements to, partner with other outfits, nonprofits and other universities, research institutions to do that more or less what I call tech scouting, tech assessment function in the commercial sector in order to get after that transition element of T3. So we have several PIAs or otherwise cooperative agreements with some nonprofits in our ecosystem that we fund as the Space Force to enable us to run programming to do that tech scouting. We started with an outfit in Colorado Springs called the Catalyst Campus, who has sort of a operation up there where they allowed their campus, allowed us to explore how we could engage kind of outside an Air Force base at their campus that more or less beget us setting up something that we call the startup accelerator. Just like you find out, startup accelerators, background on those are just, they're based on the lean startup methodology about helping companies find a market segment. And what we did is use them. They're sort of like a 3-month boot camp, more or less. We use that same concept to help companies find a mission fit for their capability, right? Enabling us to kind of do this boot camp, this close engagement with private sector companies just to understand and assess their technology capabilities, to understand does it have use and utility with us in the Space Force. So we've been running that Catalyst Accelerator since about 2017, I think. That later beget another accelerator here in Albuquerque we call the Hyperspace Challenge, facilitated through one of our local community colleges. The Central New Mexico Community College runs that Hyperspace Challenge for us. It's sort of a sister accelerator. Together, those two accelerators we call the Space Force Accelerator Program, but they're doing essentially that mission fit orientation around technology. And then we realized that there was a lot more interesting engagement that could be done in this fashion. And so we stood up another incubating model that we call the Q Station here in Albuquerque. The Q Station is more or less our off-base front door to the Air Force Research Lab here in Albuquerque. It allows us to really, the private sector can't very well engage with us behind the fence that easily, behind the gate at Kirtland Air Force Base that easily where we reside. So the Q Station was meant for us to have a presence where we could do that collaboration with the private sector a little bit more easier. And what we seemed to realize after running the accelerators, within these incubators is that there was more engagement that could happen. And those incubators are meant to help us further explore what are the business cases for these companies and how could the government utilize their functions. So we have 2 of those now that have stood up, one at the Q Station, and one with a nonprofit called New Space Nexus that runs the Igniter program. And in that program, they're also exploring, is there a way to help companies, these small companies, like I said, these small commercial companies that may not have a lot of provenance or traction, is there a way for us to engage with them, transfer our expertise to them to enable them to increase their technology readiness level so that they then can become a provider to one of the major primes, for instance, or perhaps become a provider themselves directly to the government. These programs are all kind of centered on that assessment and how do you understand ways to increase industrial base capacity, using our expertise then to grow that kind of sector for us to use. So all of that here in Albuquerque, well, most of it in the Colorado Springs, I would call it the Rio Grande corridor between Colorado Springs and here in Albuquerque. And I should say the side note is, there's an economic development play, right? There's an ancillary benefit to all of this work. Even though we are doing the tech transfer and transition mission specifically, all of that investment by the Department of the Air Force really has had this really, I think, effective ancillary benefit to the local economy in that it drives economic development functions that, that a lot of other probably regions enjoy. It especially helped this region here in New Mexico. If you think of us adjacent, the Air Force Research Lab, as one of the federal labs here in New Mexico, next door to Sandia National Labs and Los Alamos National Labs, together, right, our tech transfer offices, I think, are helping drive some economic value for the region. And I say all that just to say we're finding that the partners that we've made, those partners that I listed through these specialized agreements, those partners then have decided on their own, sort of in their own private sector capacity, to collaborate and coordinate together alongside the universities in New Mexico, right? The University of New Mexico, New Mexico State University, and New Mexico Tech and others, alongside us as the federal lab front, to create sort of this new economic, especially for space, this new economic foundation that is helping kind of drive the conversation around New Mexico as a center of space science and tech research. And they're starting to they're branding themselves in that national front, very, very kind of loose confederation of players branding themselves as the Space Valley, right?
Oh, great.
Similar to what you hear, Silicon Valley, this is the Space Valley that, depending on the partners that you talk to, but the most widest, perspective I've been given from several of the entities is that it runs mainly from Colorado Springs through the New Mexico Rio Grande corridor, Albuquerque, down to our Spaceport America, which is outside Las Cruces, where New Mexico State University is, down to El Paso and UTEP, and into some of the space elements that are running in Texas. So the Space Valley is sort of this new, I think, very neat but unexpected kind of ancillary benefit that occurred through all of this work that we at AFRL pioneered by working in the private sector.
That's huge. That's for it to sort of culminate in something that's not to be truly not to be sort of cheeky about it, but to have it to a point where you can name it, where it's getting some branding, is saying something that it's reached a certain critical mass, maybe, or it's beginning to. So that's wonderful to hear.
It's a way to put it, a critical mass that has kind of established itself after all this work that's being done.
Yeah, and I'm sure I can't wait to see sort of where it goes from here as this all continues to grow and accelerate.
I'm excited too.
Are there any, not to pick favorites, are there any sort of success stories that are recent or maybe stand out in your mind that you could share from any of the projects that have gone through the Tech Transfer and Transition Office?
Yeah, there are actually several. I think I can highlight two of them. One of them is a particular, our research lab has long been and had expertise in solar cell technology. And as you can imagine, really important to satellites. Mm-hmm. So as you pioneered the efficiency, one of the main kind of elements of work that was being done is to just help try to continue to increase the efficiency of the solar cell efficiency of solar panels that are on satellites. But also, you can imagine as we're trying to help increase the functionality of spacecraft in sort of a small form factor. A lot of times when you deploy satellites or when you create a satellite, you're trying to create it in a small form factor to get it into orbit. But then sometimes you need it to become larger, essentially, to take advantage of, the environment. And so sometimes things are folded up. I saw one place where people were interested. The people who developed the kind of structural mechanics of satellites oftentimes are also in the business of understanding how to fold them kind of into a compact space, and then when they get to orbit, enable them to kind of unfold, right, into that larger form factor. One of the technologies we pioneered was something called the rollout solar array, or ROSA. ROSA was a partnership that we had and our researchers had with a private sector company. And as that technology was matured within the lab, it was our office that helped work with the commercial sector to understand how to then commercialize it. And so what we call the rollout solar array has gained a lot of traction, mainly subsumed into the Redwire Corporation, which is one of the companies then that really markets it to the wider market, space market for use. That came, from inside AFRL. That's one of our classic, what we call technology transfer highlights, was how do we transfer this expertise and then working alongside the company through various other agreements, tech transfer agreements, to kind of create that rollout solar array with Redwire. And the opposite side of the house, again, right, we have that transition mission, which is looking at how do I look at commercial sector capability and determine if it has a mission fit. One of those companies, let me back up. One of the companies that we discovered in the private sector, through several of those programs I told you about, enabled us to find a new capability that we didn't know of and that the company didn't realize would be useful. So I'll tell you that story, which is during one of our Hyperspace Challenges events, cohort, and I've been telling this story a few times now, so I'm getting mixed up as to which cohort it was, but I think it was the 2020 or 21 cohort of the Hyperspace Challenge. We had a problem set. We usually advertise the problem set that we care about, and then invite companies to apply to be part of our accelerator to get after that problem set, right? Or to showcase what they have that might be used for that problem set. That's probably the more accurate way to say it. So for that year in Hyperspace Challenge, we had developed the problem set around, or we had basically curated a problem set for many of the people working on this around how do you predict the health of a satellite while it's in orbit so that you could take care of any potential problems that might come down the line. Because, right, satellites are remote systems. Once you deploy them, you can't really go get them and fix them like you can with your terrestrial system. Once they're there, they're there. When they fail, typically, when an element of them ceases to work, you have to either find workarounds, or sometimes it just completely takes down the mission. So there's always been interested in how do we know if things are going to fail ahead of time so that we can prep to continue the mission around whatever happens. Mm-hmm. And that we had that as a mission, we had that as a problem set for the Hyperspace Challenge. And that particular year, we advertised that challenge several, and that was one of many. There were many companies out there that were like, hey, we've got technology for this, that, and the other thing. One of the companies that came to us happened to be a local Albuquerque company. The founding team came out of Sandia National Labs. They're called RS21, and they were a data analytics company, and they were mainly focused in the bio and health sector. But when they came to that challenge, one of the things they wanted to showcase to us is that they had a interesting algorithm to predict the onset of cancer in an oncology patient that they thought could be used to predict the health of a satellite and when a particular system or component on a satellite might fail.
Wow.
Which we thought was hugely interesting, right? So through the course of the accelerator, they were able to engage with us and with we brought in some NASA colleagues for this to understand, what was this possible. In fact, we had one of our sister organizations at the base here at Kirtland, Space Systems Command Innovation and Prototyping Group. They were owners of the Space Test Program, which includes, interactions with NASA for how to get things into orbit, and for actually flying test missions. So one of the test missions they brought back, it was, I think it was STP-5, so Space Test Program Mission 5. There was some older data that they were able to bring to bear to let this company crunch on the actual kind of historical events that happened to understand, hey, an element for that system had some trouble. Could this algorithm predict what the failure mode was? Mm-hmm. And then you could kind of prove that by the fact that we already knew what it was from the previous analysis. And sure enough, as they went through that coordination, or when they went through that kind of exercise of the algorithm, they were able to really focus and bring to light what was the component that may have failed. And so they kept refining the algorithm over with additional data. The main takeaway then is that, right, they produced a whole new kind of business line for themselves in space. And what I thought was neat is that we found capability that we would have never found otherwise, that wasn't even geared for space. It was geared for something, a different sector, through this sort of neat arrangement using accelerators and incubators to find the technology. And then several of those other programs went on to help that company, the Q Station, the New Space, Nexus, Igniter. They all helped that company then increase, or I should say, gain some insight into their business traction with the space side of the house, and help them along their route to become a provider with the U.S. Space Force, which they are now still in the early stages, but they have been able to really develop that new business line for prediction of satellite health with that algorithm. So all just a neat story about how we were using this tech transfer office to help the Space Force then find some capability that they could then ingest for future mission sets.
Wow, that's a great story. Just the alignment of everything there is like the essence of what I hear so often from the private sector and from the federal lab side, that the challenge of not knowing what you don't know or what's out there or what's needed from both sides is so often at the root of the challenge. And for this to just sort of bring everyone together and have that amazing outcome is really incredible.
Yeah, it was fantastic. Fantastic experience.
So now if I could shift gears, that you were recently elected to serve in the next term as the FLC's Mid-Continent Deputy Regional Coordinator. And so for listeners who aren't familiar, the FLC has these 6 regions across the country. Each one has a regional coordinator and a deputy regional coordinator that really represent the labs and ecosystems within that area. So tell me about what appealed to you about that position and what your hopes are for, what you might focus on or accomplish while you're in this role.
Yeah, so I've long been I say long now, it doesn't feel that long, but since being in this tech transfer office and now leading that office, I would even go so far as to say we're very well coordinated, very well connected and collaborating with the other 2 federal labs here, Sandia and Los Alamos. So that's easy because it's right in our backyard. But through just our normal tech transfer ecosystem, if you will, but also through interactions in the FLC, we've seen a lot of value in enabling those different federal lab elements to work together on both how we do our business for our own purposes when it comes to understanding what the commercial sector is doing, how do we transfer out to it, how do we transition in from it. And I think the story I told earlier about how that had that ancillary benefit to drive a regional economic development was so impactful to my understanding of what this tech transfer mechanism could do, that me and my colleagues talked a lot about it and thought, couldn't we? I know this has been worked probably a lot. So I'm not saying that this is anything new, but is there any way that we could continue to innovate in order to bring some of those lessons learned to bear in a larger region? And so working with my counterparts at those two national labs and their experience with FLC and FLC more generally, I decided that it might be interesting to take this experience after this amount of time and see if I couldn't more formally engage within the FLC in that kind of larger regional dynamic. And so if you look at the mid-continent region, right, really that whole middle section of the U.S., where we have many national labs and other federal labs and federal lab designations for organizations, actually, that I think could drive a lot of regional economic growth, if we work together across that federal lab element and those connections we have through FLC to enable that. So that's one of the reasons I decided to, and it was at the recommendation of one of my colleagues at Sandia National Labs to go ahead and put myself forward to kind of get into this role and see if we couldn't bring this to bear. So that's what I did, and that's what I would like to work on. Is there ways that we can continue to work across these sectors for finding interesting technology that each of us and our agencies might want to use, like I just described, as well as how do we maybe better use the whole set of authorities given to us and maybe think more innovatively about how we use those authorities to help our regions and their economic development function within those regions to drive value, to create ultimately what I think, I think of these tech transfer mechanisms as one way to enable, economic development. And how does that drive the industrial base that we all depend on for what we do across the different federal government agencies? So that's what I would like to do. That's what my goal is to see if I can't work with the partners across that region and figure out clever ways that we can partner together. One example, perhaps I could show you what I'm talking about specifically is this, right? As the Air Force Research Lab here in New Mexico, we're driving some of those programs and projects I described, right? We have accelerators, incubators, we're taking companies, trying to understand what they do. The two national labs here are doing also some really interesting, innovative work through their tech transfer function. Los Alamos runs a program called LEAP, the Lab Embedded Entrepreneur Program. They have others surrounding it, but the basic gist of it is they invite founders of companies, startup companies, into their lab for a period of time, right? They open up an application, people apply, and if you're selected, if the work your company is doing has some adjacency to the work in that particular federal lab that they're working on, for about a year or two, they'll let that entrepreneur work inside the lab on their particular business, but gain and surround themselves with the expertise of those lab employees to help that company basically mature its technology, its basic science and technology understanding so that that company gains traction. Wow. And just like I described with our accelerators, they're trying to understand how they could drive that industry-based element that would be then useful for the agency. So locally, what's happened, and this has happened sort of just ad hoc, to be honest with you, but that we're also trying now to more formally work together around it is, in some cases, the companies that came into that program LEAP for Los Alamos, as they were getting, you could almost think of it as incubated within the lab, inside the lab, as they were entering in that program, it turns out that company also gained benefit from working in one of our programs. In several instances, for instance, we had a few of the companies where we, through our Q-Station programming, enabled that company to have a place to work and engage with us as the research lab, as we looked at what they could do to transition technology and then help them point to the Department of the Air Force's SBIR, STTR programming, which is right adjacent to my tech transfer programming. In fact, side story is some of the operation that and my colleagues have run here have underpinned the stand-up of what is called SpaceWorks, which is the Space Force's SBIR, STTR innovation engine. And so we're right next to that as we find companies that are interesting. SBIRs or STTRs are great ways for those companies then to get into the government pipeline. And we found that then working with the other national labs here, if those companies progress in their programs and they're being incubated in one of our programs, they have a particular on-ramp opportunity to, like SBIRs or other pathways into the Department of the Air Force. So there's this synergy in the real sense of the word between these programs that each of us are running here locally. And I think what I would love to do is explore how could you do that more broadly in this mid-continent region to sync up programs perhaps and leverage the different things going on in a more maybe deliberate fashion to help to help grow that industrial base.
Excellent. I mean, I can't wait to see what comes from that. And it sounds like we've got the right person for the job. We've got experience on the ground. And so thank you. And please come
Maybe.
back. Well, we'll have to have you back to give an update on how that's going, maybe once we dig into your term.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. That'd be amazing to see how it went.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. Well, if people want to connect with you or your office, what's the best way for them to reach out?
Yeah, I think one of the absolute best ways, to be honest with you, is through LinkedIn. So look me up on LinkedIn. I often take messages there too. I have also a contact point. It's sort of our outreach contact email that a lot of us in our office use. Mine is Gabe at AFRL New Mexico, all one word, .com. That's sort of my initial front door email, so I can help field questions and put you in the right direction.
Perfect. Well, Gabe Mounce, thank you again so much for your time and everything you shared with us.
I appreciate it, Andrea. Thank you so much.
And thanks to you, our listeners, for tuning in for this conversation and spreading the word about this podcast. Subscribe and listen to more episodes on YouTube, Apple, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform. Check the show notes or the episode page at federallabs.org for links to more resources and information that came up in our conversation. Thanks as always to our producer and digital marketing manager, Carly Dunow, graphics manager, Danny Batchelor, web content and systems manager, Jess Klein, and the FLC staff and community for your support. We'll see you back in 2 weeks for Transfer Files Tuesday. Thanks for tuning in to the Transfer Files, your insider's look at federal tech transfer. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay connected for more episodes exploring how hundreds of government laboratories and countless industry partners are driving innovations that shape our lives.